Hey, so let's I guess kick things off then. Um, so I had this topic for revisiting ambient traffic redirection. Um, there have been several folks who have reached out on this issue where um, they're a lot of them are using Azure and SQL Server, but generally anytime they've got sort of a um, request hedging sort of pattern. Um, where they're sending two requests and you want to use whichever one succeeds. It's like a primary failover database IP returned back from DNS is sort of the big reason that's causing some issues with how Ambient is doing traffic redirection and traffic proxying. But that's getting too much in the details. Sorry about that. But high level ideas. I'm wanting to restart the conversation on potentially supporting some traffic redirection configuration for Ambient and for zTunnel specifically, because of the situation like I just sort of laid out briefly. We're seeing people who have some things they can't change when it comes to their traffic proxying. Fixing it in zTunnel is non-trivial because the Linux APIs don't have a way to essentially accept like traffic on a socket conditionally based on whether they could. So basically, we could take the send like proxy request, see if it succeeds, and then send the ACK back. Linux APIs don't give you a ton of flexibility to be able to do those sorts of things, at least not easily.
Just me, or did we lose Keith?
Yeah, we lost him.
Yeah, we lost him. He got redirected.
I'm back. Sorry, my internet failed. High level, wanted to open this conversation again to see how we feel about this because it's causing people to not be able to migrate to Ambient without being able to selectively limit redirection to zTunnel for certain ports or IP addresses.
So Keith, could you I know you kind of stopped talking about the use case, but actually it would be useful to talk about the use case more.
Sure. So and I invited some folks here, anybody on the issue who cares about this, to discuss it. So you can correct, if they're here, they can correct me on the details. But as far as I understand, the SQL Server client, that's the one I'm most familiar with for obvious reasons. But the SQL Server client essentially does this sort of first past the post load balancing / routing thing where DNS returns two IP addresses, like a primary and a standby. And if the primary fails, like if the connection to the primary fails, then use the standby connection. But if the connection to the primary succeeds, the connection to the standby will fail. And so in that case, both connections will hit zTunnel, and you can run into a race condition where the zTunnel will proxy the connection to the standby because it accepts the connection from the client. And zTunnel chooses the standby connection finishes first. zTunnel tries to open that connection. That one fails. And so the client in the user's application sort of propagates that failure back, even though if it chooses the primary the primary IP address, then it would succeed. It's a very like SQL server-y or database server sort of thing. I think it's the way that most SQL servers, that Microsoft SQL Server works in Azure. I think it's been around for a while, but it's not something that I can envision us supporting easily natively in zTunnel.
So the SQL Server client is actually has a hard reliance on the semantics of the packets, not just the socket protocol?
I believe so. Somebody had a really good write-up and trying to find it and link it in a comment.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, aside from it being a bad idea, like conceptually it's pretty simple, right? They just dial a bunch of TCP connections, and the ones that are established are used.
Okay.
Like, it's kind of a I wouldn't recommend anyone write an application that does this, but it's not the most complicated.
And it's just because of proxying through ztunnel, the connections succeed when they shouldn't.
Yeah, every connection succeeds, and it's the same with sidecars, not ztunnel specific.
Is there anything we can do to improve ztunnel's semantics here?
The only thing you can do is kernel level things.
Yep.
So yes, there is, but not necessarily easy ones.
I just linked an issue that better explains the protocol. I linked it in the chat. I should probably link it in the meeting notes as well. But it explains the SQL Server interaction specifically. Let me get here. Yeah, this is a pretty good walkthrough. And Johnson already weighed in.
And in DNS, there are multiple A records. Is that what is being resolved? So it's like a headless service.
Yes, it tries to open a connection to each of the IPs returned in the DNS A records. Correct.
There's no other,
sorry.
load balancing semantic here. Right, it's going to open connections to all of them. And it's not trying to do any kind of smarter selection than that.
Based on this issue, the way that the servers operate on the SQL Server side is that only a single instance is listening for connections at any given time, but the DNS returns IP addresses for all of them, and whichever one. So the coordination happens on the server side, essentially. And the client just picks whichever IP address connection, whichever IP address results in a successful connection. There we go.
So the only other way, so what ztunnel would have to do is not accept the connection until it had established the upstream.
Correct. Correct. Don't send the ACK back or the SYN-ACK back until you've successfully been able to talk to the upstream.
Okay. So John, you want to talk? So
yeah, so my concern with this, I'm actually fine with inbound being removed, which we already have an option of those remove all ports instead of specific ones, which is good enough for most cases, but maybe not. The reason why that's fine is because, and I hated that with sidecars. It sucked for sidecars because what would happen is you would bypass support and then none of the clients know that and they try to send M2Ls to it and it fails. But H1 doesn't need capture. So the only thing you lose is observability and OTC. And I think that's pretty intuitive that if you say bypass port 80, that your policy that says block port 80 doesn't apply, right? But outbound, like in theory, it's fine because it's not going to like break, like I say, bypass this port or whatever. I won't do MTLS to it. So maybe if they're strict on that side, it's broken, but it's not going to like fundamentally break anything. I just find that typically what's happening is the user gets an issue like this. And they're like, what's the IP to bypass? They have no clue. I know that for your Azure one, you said there's a list of IPs somewhere, so maybe in that specific case, it's fine. But usually the answer is I have absolutely no idea. So they go to port. And they're like, I'm going to block port 8080 because my database is on port 8080. And then suddenly, oops, there's actually 20 other things I'm trying to reach on the same port, and I had no idea, and now I'm kind of screwed. So
exclude outbound port is like very dangerous.
Yeah.
Keith, why is VIP insufficient here?
Can you be more specific about like why
So-
SQL Server doesn't offer a VIP, or why?
So let's say we
Service entry
allocate.
network.
Let's say we allocated a VIP in front of like however many IPs, right? zTunnel will try and connect to each one of them, right? Eventually, we will detect that all of them are unhealthy except for one of them, right? Because you said there's only one, and then we would just route traffic to the available IP.
So you were saying use an egress, basically egress gateway, sort of thing. Assign a VIP to like auto allocate an IP for it, and then zTunnel would attempt to call it based on those A records, the same way a regular client would.
Mhm.
Would zTunnel try all the A records in parallel, or would it try just one? I think it would try just one.
And then it would try the next one, and the next one.
On the same connection?
It's a VIP, right? So as far as, right, we're trying to pick a back end, right, for an inbound connection, right? We're going to pick a healthy back end, ideally. You know, maybe there's some improvements we could make to how we do that. But if we can't establish, right, then that's immediately unhealthy, right? So I guess, like, have we tried it? Like, create a service entry, allocate a VIP, put the actual IPs behind it, and test it with the client.
The IPs, the service entry work for CIDR ranges? If you have a explicit CIDR ranges?
So no, just like as a manual test, right? You know the physical, like the actual IPs, the endpoints, right? As
That's
a
what I'm
test,
saying.
right?
Okay, because as a test in this test scenario,
Right,
Can we
because
just-
obviously the SQL Server resides on specific IPs, not on just a CIDR range, right?
I mean,
So use this
they can change, but like for a test, we could
Sure, but
find
like-
a couple of
like-
specific ones.
But like it's a discovery problem, not a connection problem then, right? Like can we update it based on new SQL Server endpoints coming up? Like how is the discovery happening? Like we can always improve service entry to say discover like the endpoints through DNS-A record lookup periodically or dynamically, right? So you connect to the BIP, right? We see we have no endpoints, but we're configured to do DNS resolution. We do DNS resolution, we get a set of A records, we attempt, right? And we proxy to the most successful endpoint. But you should be able to test this manually right now, right?
Right. If I can find what the IP addresses are, in theory, that should work. I just don't know enough about how zTunnel, how the auto allocation step works. So this DNS load balancing Istio D is sending the results based on. Okay, I can try to test that. It would my concern would be, are we okay? Or I guess more of a question than concern. Like, are we okay with encoding that sort of service discovery context inside zTunnel natively? There's much-
way like that pattern seems more likely and more safe, right, than trying to do a whole bunch of bypass weirdness.
I mean, the bypass weirdness felt like a easier lift to me just because the APIs already exist, and I agree on port if we did exclude outbound CIDR ranges, that would solve the immediate problem without a ton of additional code for this use case.
Right, but we'd lose a bunch of capability, and like this, as CIDR ranges could be unstable, right? If this dynamically programmed DNS, then the IPs are just randomly selected. Like that doesn't work. Where like we already have like dynamic DNS resolution features.
So essentially, this would be a mode in zTunnel that would do discovery based on when we find a service based on the IP, the virtual IP, in the service entry that we assigned it, then do discovery of endpoints based on what we get back from DNS.
Yeah.
Do we do asynchronous DNS resolution today? Because
Sort of.
that's
Not
Because we
like-
need we need like an Envoy-S type of thing to sort of keep up to date what endpoints are, and so that would be the
Right, but
that
then
would
what
be
do you
the new
have?
feature.
I mean, you do DNS to get them, but then do you health check them as well?
It would have to be passive health checking, John, I think.
If it's passive, then you need retries for that connection.
We're,
Because you could pick a wrong one.
right. So right. We're already down the rabbit hole retry, right? Which we know as a rabbit hole we need to go down anyway.
Ian, you might have some context added because I know you actually have a topic on the IP allocation stuff.
I've seen a user request something similar to this, but their client did a race. There were multiple ones that could respond, and whichever one responds first is the correct one to connect to. And it seems like if we would have to include some sort of randomness if we're not going to actually implement a race in zTunnel to see which endpoint connects. Or else we're going to break them and we're just going to always send to the first one. So it does seem like, although this fixes like the very specific SQL Server semantic that Keith was describing, there may be other real similar things that are still going to be broken, potentially. And
Yes,
to be
I mean,
fair, I don't have a link to an issue or even to that Slack thread. I just sort of remember the topic coming up. So,
I mean, we have that issue anyway in service entry. Like if they list the endpoints manually, right? We can't just pick first, right, for connection attempt, right? Otherwise, we'll hotspot the endpoint for all the clients. So we should be doing random anyway.
Interesting. Okay. So, because we got other topics, I want to make sure you have time to get to those. So it sounds like maybe a next step here is to validate that service entry VIP works manually, and then potentially come up with a design doc to bring in this sort of DNS endpoint discovery within zTunnel.
Right. And then layer, if we need to layer over some customization of the semantics about how you should pick the endpoint out of what's discovered from the A records or SRV records.
Right. Race, first healthy, that sort of thing. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I can do that. Thank you. That's super helpful.
Okay, Keith, do you want to take a stab at capturing that in the notes? Sorry.
Yeah, I totally can.
I can do it.
I can do it.
Zero, are you here? Sorry. I don't think Zeron is here, but we should talk about release managers anyway. Looking for volunteers for 127. Oh, we have volunteers already. Gustavo as primary. Since
I think this was added last week, and there may have been updates since then. So I don't know if there's an action required here.
yeah, okay. I will update the notes. Jackie.
Cool. Yeah, so I just wanted to discuss, John, I actually wanted your feedback, or at least your review on the Istio CNI issue and race condition on node restart for ambient. Have like a working solution for basically for one of the solutions that we proposed for resolving this race condition. One being adding an init container, and then the other is adding a Istio owned CNI config. So again, just kind of a quick summary of the issue. like on a node restart in ambient, the primary CNI might override or overwrite the primary CNI config file, which we append our Istio CNI plugin to. So by overwriting, it removes the Istio CNI plugin. If the Istio CNI daemon set is not ready before any of the like meshed pods, like they're saying, like are recreated, then they are not going to be configured for redirection because the Istio CNI daemon set hasn't re-added the Istio CNI plugin to the config list in the primary CNI config file. So essentially, you get mesh bypass on node restart. I really want to get this in for 127. I know this is blocking folks from adopting ambient due to this concern and not having a workaround. Again, this isn't an issue for Sidecar because we have an init container and we're waiting on the CNI to be ready before starting. So again, it's not an issue for Sidecar, but it is an issue for ambient. So what I've proposed here in this issue is adding a separate Istio CNI owned config. So we essentially copy the primary CNI config contents of the config file contents and then append our plugin to that file. So then it's not going to be overwritten on node restart. So I guess, yeah, I think, John, you probably have the most context on this. So I'd appreciate your thoughts because I know you were also somewhat interested in the adding an init container for ambient.
Yeah, this is awesome. Sorry that I have not had much time to look into this. I feel like this approach is likely good. It's just one of those things where it's like there's so many crazy environmental factors that I'll never have confidence, you know, which maybe just means it's good to just try out with a flag, maybe off by default. I don't know how much confidence
That's the way it is. It's off by default. It's hidden behind, like, you know, you're kind of you're choosing to take this on. If you want the fix, you're choosing to take on a, you know, I can't handle every edge case kind of scenario. But yes, yeah, it's opt-in, and then users can also specify their own CNI config file name if they don't like the default that we're using, so they can adjust the priority level too. But we don't do any validation on that. But like, you can set your own.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, I think this is good. I mean, it's not good, but it's the best I think we can do. So, like, just given what Kubernetes gives us. So, hopefully, there's been some. Actually, I don't know. Like, there was a ton of activity on this issue in Kubernetes with like every important networking person Kubernetes commenting on, and then it died. So I don't know if they just stopped commenting on the issue or if they got distracted by other things. But hopefully, eventually, this is improved upstream. For now, yeah, this seems good. So sorry, what specifically did you need from me now that I've said it looks good? Like just approval on the PR itself?
Yeah. I mean, there's a few things I was just waiting. I mean, if this was the direction we wanted to go, there was just a few things I wasn't gonna spend my time making it perfect if this wasn't the direction we wanted to go. So just a general, like, yeah, let's move forward with this approach would be helpful. So yeah, I think I have that. So that's all I needed.
Okay, awesome. Sounds good. And I need to drop off now. So perfect.
Yeah, just add your thoughts to the PR. Add that note to the PR. So then, you know, just
sounds good.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome.
Thanks so much for working on this. This is really good. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's all I needed. But yeah, I appreciate anyone else's thoughts on this, given how kind of critical it is, or in the critical path. So any other eyes on it would be awesome, or especially with any other folks who have different or maybe unique CNI setups. If they could test this out, that would be amazing. I can post that in the Slack as well.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Appreciate it. So next up, we have Tyler. Is Tyler here?
I thought I saw him on the call. Maybe he dropped.
I think the ask is just reviews on this request authentication policy without itch specified. I haven't been able to track this as much just because I don't have a ton of context in the JWT stuff. The API merged, and this is just implementation. So I think it's probably good to go from a conceptual perspective.
Okay, see who else has been reviewing this. Zira and obviously took a look at it at some point just to run it through the testing. Pass. I have not had a chance to look at this. Since Tyler's in here, maybe we just take this up offline. But if people have cycles, then please take a look. Keith.
Am I next? Okay.
More
Yeah.
PRs.
Yes. I think we just tackled the first one. I think Jackie added the top. I may have missed Jackie's topic, so we can skip that. And then the
Okay.
other one here is a multi-cluster PR that's been out for 2 to 3 weeks. Small change, one file that just corrects some of the waypoints, multi-cluster load balancing behavior. So we really appreciate detail maintainers to take a look there.
Does anybody have bandwidth to look at this?
I mean, which maintainers are needed?
I guess Ian was the other one Keith identified. Is Ian on here? Yes.
I am on here. I haven't had a lot of time, but I should try and get back to this. I'm real sorry about that.
No problem. Looking at gtunnel maintainers, we do only have 4 between John, Ian, Jonghu, and Steven. So yeah, we expect certain delays in it. We should talk about finding more maintainers to help out their workload at some point. But yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to Mihail and my team. Oh, only 3 doc maintainers. Ooh, okay, yeah, we should get on.
Yes.
Okay.
Ian.
Yeah. I just had a general question about a PR that came in. Historically, we haven't allowed users to select the ranges that we auto-allocate IPs from. We could do that relatively easily with the V2 allocation method, and they have a PR that sort of does that. I think there's a bunch of varying amount of risks to just letting them send an arbitrary prefix that we're going to use. And the validation and what to do if the validation passes is not clear to me and potentially wonky. So the idea that I had sort of come up with was, what if we just have an alternate range that's sort of pre-blessed? We don't have to validate it. You flip on, I want to use the alternate range. And we know that Istio can start and that the range is of a reasonable size and will parse and all of the good things that we don't want to have to worry about when we're trying to start a controller. So yeah, those were sort of the two options, or I guess the third one being, we continue to do nothing and you change your Kubernetes setup if you have a conflict with our ranges. Do folks have like thoughts, opinions on that?
So what would be the recommended ranges? Like we're using in the loopback range right now, right?
Presently, what is it? It's, like a benchmarking range that we use or something like that. They did have a proposal for an alternate range in that PR, I think, when I brought it up. But yeah, that would be the next question is, if we want to have some sort of secondary blessed range, what range is that? Keith?
Yeah, is it the 240 like class E non-RT 18 space that we use today?
Yeah, we're 240, 240/16, I think.
Yeah, okay. So that range is nice because it is not like in the spec. It doesn't appear in RT 1918, so there's a very low risk of conflicts. The problem is that when I was a GKE customer, I do believe GKE uses that rate as that secondary IP range for pod IPs for skill purposes, if I'm not mistaken. And so I imagine that's where the conflict comes from. I think it's a pretty good default range. If someone's having conflicts, I think it might make sense to maybe have a fallback range where you can find suitable space somewhere else that doesn't appear in RFC 1918. I'd be very worried about the user experience of like letting people bring their own ranges. That just feels like people could foot gun themselves relatively easily without clear notice either.
Or like what kind of API would we use to name these ranges, right? Like if we're gonna package them in an API like this, we're gonna have to name them. Alternatively, it's just documentation that says, look, here's a set of recommended ranges specified as CIDR blocks. If you use something else, it's do it at your own risk, right? But at least the API surface is clear. So either we're shipping a first-class API or we're moving the concern into docs.
Yeah. Well, my thought was just we would have, I've done nothing and it continues to work as it always has for the last 5 years or whatever. You get 240, 240.
Right.
Or you just, assert something. I don't know if it's mesh config or an environment variable, but it's alternative service entry range. The name that we give it is it's the alternative.
Right. So then like we have two, like default and alt, right? So now we have two.
Yeah.
And let's say now we need to have three. Right. Because Lord knows that type of thing happens.
That is one of the noted downsides is there is probably one user somewhere in the world that will have their service network on 240, 240 and their pod network on our alternate range, and they will be broken. In fairness, they would already be broken, so they're probably
right. But then what do
not
they
an
do?
Istio user, but
well, yeah. So that's a cliff we don't want, right? Between being an Istio user and not an Istio user.
yeah, precisely.
Can we detect range conflicts? Can we have an auto? Since these are VIPs anyway, so nobody actually cares what they really are. Because they're ephemeral, right?
Yeah. They're pseudo ephemeral now.
Yes. It's okay if they change, let me put it that way. Right, and it's Istio's job to deal with the fact that they change at runtime. But yeah, I guess the basic question is, do we have a way to know if we have conflicts? do we even assert, right, during like any installation or startup step that these ranges are conflicting with various reserved ranges specified in Kubernetes configs?
We presently do not. We could, I suppose, check, I guess, any pod, see if that pod falls into our range, and any service, and see if the service IP falls into our range, like hypothetically.
I feel like I'd almost rather than detecting conflicts, I'd rather, if you have to detect conflicts, I'd rather just give the user the ability to bring their own. Like, I don't love that, but just because, for example, their pod IPs might not have a reserved range, they might have a network appliance somewhere else within their environment that conflicts. There's only so much checking we can do. And so if like we're going to get into that territory, we may as well just provide an API to be able to customize the range. And then add some validation to make sure it's large enough. Like I at least slash 21 or slash 16 if you just want to be consistent.
Right, so like we can have an API which is like the value is default alt1, alt2, alt3, right? And we just document them and then reserve CIDR range, like manually specified CIDR range. Right, at least the API can grow that way, but it doesn't have to immediately add the CIDR range. If we can identify some alts and they solve for 99% of the people, then I think that's fine to defer adding the arbitrary CIDR range. And we just document what the defaults and alts are.
I think that's my preference. And if we need alt2 and alt3 eventually, then I guess we got a lot of users because we're hitting the 1.1 of 1% situation. But yeah,
at some point, like we'll declare bankruptcy, right, and say like where having another alt is not a good idea. But it's useful to have the alts because they are curated in some sense by looking through the RFCs and picking reasonable ranges, right?
Yeah, precisely. And we've pre-validated them. We can potentially have like maybe a post-install test that chooses a random alt range when it runs for service entry. The pre or post-install, the post-merge. The pre-test can always use the default. There's a lot more options there, I think. So.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't think we need to test every permutation either, right? That's prohibitive.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Ian, do you want to? Keith, does that sound reasonable to you?
Yes. The only question I have, which you may have answered, is do we see any users where our default ranges aren't large enough for them? Because another permutation of this feature is allow me to expand the CIDR range for auto allocation, which this would not solve. So what if I want to use both the class E space that we have today and another CIDR range? It feels like we're one step there. So I'm curious to know how we run into that yet. And if so, maybe it makes sense to solve that problem.
Right, so our default is /16, right? So we're getting what, 65K range, 65K IPs.
Yeah,
that's a lot, I think.
I've never seen someone complain about the size.
it's tied to service entry, so you'd be talking about 65K service entries.
Technically, host names in the service entry, so you could maybe just have one with a lot of host names in it.
You'd probably run into XTD/ limits maybe before.
In practice.
Well, but that's true.
Well, I think what we could do, we can make the setting a list and not just a singleton, right? So
Yeah.
So you could say like default comma alt 2 is allowed as well as just equals default.
Yeah.
And that way you could kind of expand it over time if that became necessary. But I don't think we have to start there either. So I don't think there's an API forward compatibility problem if we decided to make it a list.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, that's all I was asking.
Yeah.
The only use case I could think of where you'd have that many service entries would be like where you're using service entry to connect your cluster in that multi-cluster sort of situation. And you have a bunch of different clusters.
Or all your services were actually service entries and workload entries because you were using console and VMs.
Right. So yeah, a list from an API perspective, a list gives us the flexibility to be able to do that later. So yeah, no more concerns for me. That sounds like a good plan of action.
Okay, Angie, do you want to just capture that in the notes, I guess, in the GitHub issue? Document.
Yeah, I can do.
Set up all on the list variation, which we don't have to support up front, but is available.
I do a little bit dislike the list idea because now we're back to they can put anything in there and get it wrong, as opposed to just a binary alt is.
No. So we could say they can have default and alt in the list, and then they can have or default and alt 1 in the list, but they can't have default and a CIDR range because we're not supporting CIDR range yet.
But suppose they put door fault due to a typo. Does Istio not come up? Now we're back to, does this controller not come up, but Istio runs and it's just silently not doing its job fully? Like that's the
what would it mean? What would it mean if they just set door fault anyway? Like, what does that mean?
Right. It means nothing except that we don't know what they want. Whereas if you have an environment variable, enable alternate range, it's true or false.
Right, but they can have a typo there as well.
True,
right?
Then you're using the default range. So there's a really reasonable fallback, in my opinion. And we could make that the fallback, right? If you put some nonsense into this list, you get the default range.
Right, that seems fine.
If that's a suitable fallback for everyone, then yeah.
Right, just emit the error in the log and say, oh, can't parse, fall back to default.
Okay, yeah, that's real sensible, in my opinion.
Okay, so yeah, just add that into the doc then.
All right. Yep, really appreciate the discussion.
Sorry, one more thing that just reminded me of. Right now, auto-allocate is an environment variable, and that's fine because we've got, and I think there's coordination between STODs and V2. If we're now adding different ranges, what happens if people they set default for one STOD replica? Oh, well, you can't, it's a deployment, so never mind. You can't have different bars. Okay, that should be fun. Never mind.
Yeah, the rest of them are just reading it out of status. So hypothetically, if you set it on some other IstioD and it's not the leader, so it's not writing status, it just doesn't take effect.
That's right, it's leader elected. That makes sense. And that means even for like on the upgrade story, it will defer to already allocated IPs and status, and everything will just use whatever's in status in theory. So that's not any opportunity for breakage. Okay, perfect.
All right. Well, I think do we have any other non-concrete agenda item topics? Are we actually going to end early for a change?
I'll take that, or we can talk about maintainers for the next 10 minutes, but I'm happy to take that offline.
I think I'm going to take the win this time.
Sounds like a plan. I could use it.
Yeah, but we should talk about maintainers and get that on the schedule. All right, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, folks.